includes images of St. Michael the Archangel, who is their patron. A memo to the officers says wearing their St. Michael badge violates the state's secularism law, saying, quote, "We ask you now to kindly remove from your uniforms any crest symbolizing or referring to the Archangel." For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping? Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you're not a Catholic, perhaps you were a practicing Catholic years ago, fell away for whatever reason, and now you've got some questions about the Catholic faith, or maybe you've never been a Catholic, but you've got questions about the Catholic faith. We can get those questions answered on today's program, hopefully your questions. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the number 1 and then 205-271-2985. I noticed that the Pop Checks took a call this morning from Melbourne, Australia. How about that? That's why they call it the Global Catholic Network, you know. Again, that out of North America number 1-205-271-2985. Or you can send us an email if you prefer that, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Michael McCall is our producer. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you?
You know, I'm hanging in there, thank you.
All ready for Christmas?
No, not even
Not even close.
Not even close, no.
Well, you and me both. Got a great email. This actually came in this morning. This is from a doctor, Dr. Stephen, who says, I would like Dr. Anders to address the question, is the war in Ukraine a just war as defined by the Catholic Church? I think this is a tremendous opportunity for education. Thank you, Dr. Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Stephen. I appreciate the question. So here are the criteria for a just war.
Okay.
Right. One side in the conflict has to be acting without cause, without any kind of rational justification, moral justification, and the prospects are of grave harm to the party being attacked, and those that are prosecuting the war on the side of the opposing the aggressors are going to use proportionate means. They're not going to inflict vastly more damage than the damage they're trying to prevent. They're not going to wage war on civilians and non-combatants and that sort of thing. Now, I am not a policymaker, nor do I have a 50,000-foot view on international relations. Like you, I only know what I know from the media.
Sure.
So I'm always hesitant to form actual moral judgment about even when somebody calls me about their own moral life. They call and say, I'm in this relationship, I have this issue, what's the right thing for me to do? I'm very hesitant to answer those kind of questions, even at the individual level, because I don't really know the situation from the inside out. I'm even more hesitant when people start talking to me about political policy or, ideological commitments in our own country. When it comes to international affairs, I'm way out of my depth. So, it certainly seems just to me. Obviously, one side seems to have justice on their side, right? More than the other. But as soon as I say that, somebody will, throw up some exception or some qualification to that I really am not privy to and I'm not qualified to answer. But the criteria are there, and that's for policymakers who, if they're generally being guided by conscience and Catholic moral thinking, would have to consider, in any kind of international conflict.
Dr. Stephen, thank you so much for your very timely email. Here's one now from Blaine. I agree with Catholic teaching on same-sex so-called marriage. However, as a Catholic American, I struggle with the idea of imposing my morality on another. How do I reconcile this?
Yeah, so here's the thing. Marriage is a public institution. It's not a private affair. It has everything in the world to do with how we replenish society, how we care for children, how we dispose of estates. I mean, it's an enormously public issue with profound public significance. So, however you come down on this issue, some ideological regime is going to impose its will on the entire nation. There's no getting away from that problem, right? The way the Catholic Church, and not only the Catholic Church, I really want to emphasize this is not just a Catholic issue. The way world civilization has traditionally treated marriage is to say, look, why is there such a thing called marriage to begin with? Well, it's for the blindingly obvious reason that when men and women get together in intimate union, babies tend to happen. And society has an interest in seeing that those kids come into the world and that they receive the care and the nurture and the protection and the rights and duties that are appropriate for them so they can be productive members of the body politic and of the civilization. And the people traditionally who have the greatest stake in those kids, the greatest responsibility to those children, and the best capacity to care for them are, in fact, the people that brought them into the world, namely the parents.
Sure.
And so marriage is just the institution that reflects that very natural arrangement, that biological arrangement even. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's imposed by a legislature or a court from the top down. It's something that has emerged in every civilization from the nature of the human person as such. Now, what's vastly different about the gay marriage regime is it takes the view that marriage is not about the replenishment of society through procreation, but is primarily about the gratification of erotic attraction and the necessity of society sanctioning any and all erotic attraction so that people who engage in that form of life will not be made to feel second-class citizens. And if you read the Obergefell decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy, who wrote the opinion, uses that language explicitly. He says you need gay marriage so that gay people don't feel bad about themselves or their children don't feel bad about themselves. Well, that's an entirely different construal about the purpose of marriage, not making people feel bad about themselves as opposed to an institution for replenishing society through procreation. And secondly, it's the gay marriage regime does not see marriage as something that arises from the very nature of the human person, but is absolutely something that is to be ideologically imposed from the top down. So if you eliminated the state, mm-hmm. And there have been many traditional and tribal societies that have not had anything like the modern superstate, they still had rituals and institutions of marriage.
Sure. There you go. And Blaine, thanks so much for your email. We have lines open for you right now. We're doing a live show on this Thursday just before Christmas. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call now.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
I don't like looking back. I prefer to look forward and keep moving forward. There's plenty to cover. I do a lot of research and try to dig out the bits and pieces of a life or of an agenda that people don't want to talk about.
The World Over with Raymond Arroyo. Tonight, 8 Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television.
This is Janet Morena of Priests for Life with Pro-Life Update. This year's March for Life in Washington will be the first one after the reversal of Roe v. Wade. It will be a time to celebrate and to renew our commitment to defend the unborn. It will also be a time to honor the dead. On Sunday, January 22nd, we will gather in front of the U.S. Supreme Court to remember the 65.5 million children killed in the womb by abortion since Roe v. Wade. This time of prayer, sponsored by Priests for Life and several other groups, starts at 11 a.m. The pro-life movement will never forget these children, each one of whom is a person with human dignity. We entrust all of them into the hands of God, and we ask forgiveness as a nation for failing to protect them. See the full schedule at priestforlife.org/March for Life. This is Janet Morena on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Wishing you a Holy Christmas and a Happy New Year from all of us at EWTN Radio.
Very glad to be with you on this Thursday, just before Christmas. Wow. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders in progress here on this Thursday afternoon. You know, we're heard on, over 300 radio stations, getting close to 400 stations coast to coast here in America. You can find out how you can help start up a Catholic radio station right there where you live, powered by the truth of the church and EWTN's dynamic radio programming. The guy you want to talk to is a fellow named Steve. He has a rather long last name, so I'm not going to give you that, but I will give you his email address, radio@EWTN.com, radio@EWTN.com. Be sure to tell Steve where you live in the United States, and then we will take it from there. We're going to get to the phones in just a moment here. We're waiting to hear from you. Rich Jesse is our phone screener for this program. Ace McKay is handling social media today. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming right now. Just put your question in the comments box. Ace will see it. He'll send it to us here in the studio. Again, that phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Here's a question from Ryan now. David, what's stopping me from becoming a Catholic is that I've heard a lot of priests and bishops are gay. Is this true?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. I have absolutely no way to give you a percentage. I can't tell you how many priests and bishops are gay. There are certainly gay priests and bishops. I can assure you that is the case. I don't know what the proportion is.
Okay.
I do think that the proportion changes with the decade, and there have been periods of American Catholic history where the proportion was higher. This is very anecdotal. I talked to seminary professors in the United States and who are very much aware of this fact, and I've said, "What's your perspective on the incoming classes in the seminaries?" And they don't think that the seminaries are free from problems, but they think that this isn't the problem that it was, say, maybe in the 1980s.
Okay.
So I don't think the new crop of priests that's coming online now, this is anywhere near the kind of issue it was maybe 30, 40 years ago.
Very good. And Ryan, thanks so much for your call. We're getting calls screened right now, and we'll go to those phones in just a moment. Here's one now from Andrea. Why do Catholics teach against contraception?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So you really can't understand the Catholic teaching on contraception if you don't understand the Catholic teaching on sexuality, right? And there's a misconception, and I've encountered it on this radio show before, that that there's somehow a fixation merely on the method of birth control without regard to the larger context of human sexual relations. What do I mean by that? I remember one time we got a call. This is probably 5 years ago. From a woman whose idea of contraception was, well, this is what young people need when they get in trouble in the backseat of the car in high school or whatever. This is how you prevent STDs. This is how you prevent unwanted pregnancies from young people that have a life to make and they don't need to get in trouble and this kind of thing. And the Catholic Church is standing, between what's just sort of an obvious public health good. How idiotic of the Catholic Church to take that line. And I remember hearing that objection and thinking, you've totally misconstrued the Catholic position. The Catholic Church has never said that, prostitutes or the promiscuous or young people shouldn't use contraception in order to avoid STDs or unwanted pregnancy. What the Catholic Church says is they shouldn't be having sex.
Big difference.
Big difference. And why is that, right? Well, because why are we sexual beings? Why do we even have this faculty of sexuality? It's naturally ordered to the procreation of children. I mean, Biology 101 is going to teach you that, right?
Yeah.
And but because we're rational and spiritual creatures, we have a degree of deliberative control and freedom over our procreative activity that animals don't. Animals do have a kind of natural instinctual nurture, and they either bond or couple or not according to species, and that's how things roll. But humans bring in their own free choice. They bring in their rational deliberation, their long-term planning into the process of child rearing in a way that animals don't. And that's what makes human sexual activity morally relevant in a way that animal sexual activity is not morally relevant, either good or bad. And because we can do that, what should we be planning for our sexual activity as it pertains to the raising of children? Well, kids need to come into the world, not only have food and clothing and shelter, but they also need love and nurture in a community of love that's really oriented to their well-being, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are best equipped to do that are those that brought them into the world, namely the parents.
As we said earlier in the show.
Exactly. And when parents have a particular kind of relationship, it conduces to the well-being of the kids. Now, what kind of relationship is that? It's one where we are not instrumentalizing one another for our own personal aggrandizement, but one where husband and wife place the spouse above themselves. They really offer themselves for the sake of the good of the family and not for their own private good, even by agreement. And that's the shape of human sexual activity in intention is intimately connected to how I regard my spouse as a person, how I regard myself as a person. And it's going to color the kind of home that I bring my child into, right? When I regard my sexuality as a gift of myself in love for a person with whom I'm committed to this project of raising kids, it's a very different kind of act from contraceptive sexuality. Now, to take an analogous position, sometimes people will ask, well, what's the difference between, living together and getting married? Why not try the thing out? And, of course, the act isn't any different at all. I mean, the material circumstances are not different at all necessarily, but the intention is vastly different. So consider the difference between I'd like to pledge myself to you until death, for better or for worse, rich or poor, sickness and in health, as long as we both shall live for the sake of raising a family with you. And whatever happens, come hell or high water, I'm not leaving. Compare that attitude to, let's try this out until next Thursday. And if I don't like, how it feels, we'll check out and try something else. The physical act may be the same, but the meaning of the act is entirely different. And so it goes to the matter of intention.
And Andrea, we hope that's helpful for you. Thanks so much for your email. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986. We begin with Mark in Indianapolis, listening on iHeartRadio today. Hey, Mark, happy Advent to you. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hey.
Howdy.
Happy Advent, Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
I was wondering where the word Christmas came from.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. So it comes from Saxon or Old English, which is, before, say the 14th century. I can't pronounce Old English or Saxon, so I won't even try. But it's the words that mean Christmas Mass, Christ Mass.
Christ's Mass.
The word Christ and the word Mass stuck together. Mass, of course, being a liturgical celebration. So this is the liturgical feast where we celebrate the birth of Christ.
There you go. Hey, Mark, thanks so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Call to communion here on EWTN on this Thursday. It's about to get very cold.
It is about to get very cold.
It's going to be like down to 12 degrees, I think, here in beautiful Birmingham, Alabama.
It's more like when I used to live in Iowa.
I know it. Let's go to Edna Marie right now, listening on Catholic Community Radio in Houma, Louisiana. Edna Marie, what's on your mind today?
In yesterday's Times Picayune from New Orleans, which I subscribe to, I saw a headline. It was on page 2A. Israelis excavating Jesus' midwife tomb. And the article, a few paragraphs, says that an ancient tomb associated with Jesus' midwife, Salome. And I just wondered where this came from and if Dr. Anders has any knowledge of this.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So I don't know anything about the archaeology, and I don't know anything about the tradition of Jesus having a midwife named Salome. It strikes me just intuitively as utter nonsense, to be honest with you, because I'm not aware. I mean, the Gospels certainly don't mention such a character. There's a Salome in the New Testament, but not identified as Jesus's midwife. And I'm not aware of any other tradition in Christian history that identifies this individual in that way. And and our access to that kind of speculative data just seems wholly incredible to me. I just don't think that. I mean, whatever somebody digs up in a cave, I think is just be very, very extremely unlikely that we would get that kind of accurate picture about a detail that's very unlikely to have been recorded at the time. I mean, it's just strikes me as very, very, very far-fetched.
Edna Marie, thanks so much for checking in from Homa here on Call to Communion from EWTN Radio. All right, Matthew is watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Matthew says, is the Magisterium essentially unfalsifiable? If so, is there any point about discussing it with non-Catholics other than to pander to falsifiable arguments from history, etc.?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. No, I wouldn't put it that way. I wouldn't say the Magisterium is unfalsifiable. First of all, the Magisterium is the teaching office of the Church that operates in several modes, and only one of them is infallible, right? So the ordinary functioning of the Magisterium is not infallible, and the popes and bishops in the ordinary course of their ministry can make mistakes and need to be corrected when they do. There's a way to go about doing that. You don't necessarily get on Twitter and make a big fuss, but canon law even has provisions for when the people of God feel like their pastoral needs are not being met. There's some sort of gross mismanagement or pastoral malpractice. There's appropriate channels for dealing with that, and it can up to and including correcting the Holy Pontiff. And that's what happened when St. Paul told St. Peter in Antioch, "Hey man, get with the program. You're kind of running off here and doing your own thing, and you're sort of forgetting the essence of the gospel." So, yeah, it's not unfalsifiable. Now, the claim that the Magisterium possesses divine authority is a faith claim, right? Now, there are reasons for us to hold that from the teaching of Scripture and sacred tradition, and some sort of secondary confirming evidences from history. But it is essentially a faith position. It's not something we can ultimately rationally prove any more than I could prove something like the inspiration of Scripture or the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, right? So there are reasons for it, and once you take that position on, it's a stance that you can have regarding Christian history that gives you a profound amount of assurance and a certainty about how to conduct yourself in the world. I think once you adopt the hypothesis, if you will, of the teaching authority of the Church, it gives you a way to do things like differentiate dogma from opinion.
Yeah.
Right? We Catholics, we get a lot of things that we do badly. One thing we do really well is delineate what it means to be a Catholic. Here are the criteria. Boom, boom, boom. We can lay it out for you. Because of the authority of the Magisterium, we know what it is to be a Catholic. And when there's a theological dispute within the tradition, when that rises to the level of division in the Church, the Magisterium has the authority to step in and go, okay, we're going to go this way and not that way. And then if you want to get on board with the Catholic Church, you got to go this way. You got to go the way the Magisterium says. So that's a tremendous utility to it. And that's part of the appeal, right? Because outside the idea of a Magisterium, there really is no principled way to decide those kinds of issues.
Yeah.
And so every other Christian communion will propose a criterion. Well, here's how you know. Here's how you know. And the other folks will say, well, yeah, that works great, except when I disagree, and then it's my way, is how you know.
Yeah.
So if you want unity in the Church, you really have to have something like the Magisterium.
Matthew, thanks for checking us out on YouTube today. Also on YouTube is Dan in Ottawa. Hey, Dan, what's on your mind today? Thanks for calling.
Oh, hi there, Dr. Anders. I'm wondering about Our Lady of Guadalupe and the canonization of Juan Diego. There isn't a lot of contemporary historical evidence about his life, so I'm wondering why the Church decided to canonize somebody who has so little direct historical evidence, and maybe how to defend that doctrine when people ask us about it.
Sure. Yeah. So you're correct that the historicity of Juan Diego has been called into question, and honestly, I haven't read the homilies and teachings of the Magisterium at that particular canonization, so I don't know what the reasoning was behind it. A lot of times, Church canonizes somebody, or we'll get some discussion of their life and so forth. And I just haven't followed up on Juan Diego, so I don't know the fine particulars. But whatever the guy's name was, I mean, there was a first person to venerate Our Lady of Guadalupe. You know, I mean, the traditions surrounding her had an historical origin, and that means they came from people. And, you know, that by tradition, it's a fellow named Juan Diego. You know, I mean, is there some room in there for some creative historians to add some nuance to that? Probably so. I'm just not personally sufficiently familiar with the details of the case to give you more than that.
Okay. Dan, thanks so much for your call. We're approaching the halfway mark here in the program today, and that means that there's an opportunity for you to give us a call. If you call right now, we can probably get you on today's show, although there's no guarantees, but looks pretty good for you. Here's that number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Again, if you're checking us out from anywhere outside of North America, we have a number just for you, and that is 1-205-271-2985. Again, that's 1 and then 205-271-2985. At the next part of the segment here, we're going to be talking with an OBGYN who wants to avoid a patient having an abortion. He wants to know what to say. Also, we're going to talk with Daniel about purgatory. Love to talk with you at 833-288-EWTN on Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Do stay with us.
Wow.
EWTN is everywhere. EWTN radio programming is provided free of charge to over 500 domestic and international AM and FM radio stations. It's a great teaching tool for Catholics and non-Catholics alike. For a complete list of EWTN AM and FM stations across America, visit EWTNradio.net. At the bottom of the page, click Affiliates. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Want to be notified when Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
60 Seconds with Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen.
Our Lord worked many miracles. Here are some of the characteristics about them. First, he worked them as signs to convince men of the fact that he who came to work these miracles was the one that was promised. He never worked a miracle to amaze a multitude. He never worked a miracle to satisfy his hunger or his thirst. He never worked a miracle to obtain a living. He never received money for the things which he accomplished. He refused to convert the stones of the wilderness into bread to satisfy his own hunger, or to cause water to gush out of a rock to slake his thirst. Instead, he asked a woman to let down her bucket to give him a drink.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
Tomorrow on More to Life, the life you were meant to live.
We'll look at how the theology of the body can help you live a more abundant life.
That's tomorrow on More to Life, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Wishing you a Holy Christmas and a Happy New Year from all of us at EWTN Radio.
Glad you're with us on this Thursday afternoon edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Hey, we'd like to say hello to another member of the EWTN radio family celebrating an anniversary this week. It is Holy Family Radio in Michigan, celebrating 12 years on the air. They now have stations in Grand Rapids, Battle Creek, and Kalamazoo. So congratulations to Vince Gale and Robert Mulderink and everybody at Holy Family Radio from your friends here at EWTN Radio. All right, let's go now. Oh, before we go to the phones.
Oh, yeah,
David?
yeah. So somebody asked about the claim by some recent archaeologists that they have discovered the tomb associated with Salome, purported to be the midwife who attended the Blessed Virgin at the birth of Jesus.
Yes.
And, I did a little digging. The character Salome is first mentioned in the Proto-Evangelion of James, which is an apocryphal gospel from antiquity. I'm familiar with that text, but I had missed that they actually identified a midwife by name. That was just sort of slipped me. So there is an ancient tradition about a midwife named Salome. St. Jerome thought it was a bunch of hooey. Right, so the fathers of the church didn't necessarily agree with that ascription.
By the way, that is a technical term, hooey.
Hooey, yeah.
Hooey. You might want to write that down. Let's go to Ben now in Cincinnati, listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Ben, happy Advent. What's on your mind today, sir?
Happy Advent to you, too. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
My question is kind of a puzzle I've had about the term Christianity. So it seems like the way we often talk and think about the term is as like a kind of genus to various species, like Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Protestantism. But if that's, but that doesn't really seem to be the way as Catholics we think about the faith. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, it seems to make Christianity, it seems to imply there's this thing, a kind of lowest common denominator that is sort of behind all these various species. And so, when you teach about Christianity, which I do, you end up lapsing or end up kind of talking about Christianity as if it's this thing that exists outside of and is sort of more basic.
I'm totally
than
with
these
you.
other.
I 100% am with you. I want to ask you a question, Ben. You said that you teach about Christianity. Are you an academic or a secondary education? What's your...
Yeah, I'm an adjunct, but yeah, I teach in a secular setting.
Okay. So if you're an academic, man, I have got the book for you.
All right.
I have got the book for you. This is just for Ben, all right? Non-academics beware. Not that I wouldn't recommend this book to anybody, but it's one of those typical dry as dust academic tomes. But if you're a specialist in the field, you would take a great interest in this. This was, for me, a profoundly transformative work of intellectual scholarship on the nature of how you do the history of religion, all right? The title of the book is Category Formation and the History of Religion by Robert Baird. Category Formation and the History of Religion by Robert Baird. And the problem that you've identified is exactly what Baird goes after, hammer and tongs, all right? So this is a problem not just for Christianity, but for any of the religious traditions of the world, insofar as we assign a kind of essential category, an ism, if you will, whether it be Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism or Islamism or we don't say Christianism in English, but they do talk about Christianisme in French. So anytime you say, when you talk about an ism, you're really saying, all right, I'm going to generalize about some phenomena and identify the common elements or properties that mark it out, essentially as the kind of thing ultimately that it is. And then once I've done that, that becomes the normative category, right? So if I have a normative conception of, say, something called Christianity, then I can fit or try to fit the various instances within that normative theory. So Catholicism, Protestantism, or whatever, Orthodoxy, sort of fit within that larger metaphysical category of Christianism or whatever it might be. And Baird's argument, which I completely agree with, is that that's not how religious traditions function, right? That the presumption that there is a kind of normative essential category that we have to fit all of the instances of the word into actually ends up doing violence to the data, right? And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So this is really, Christians do this all the time, right? They'll get a normative idea about, real Christianity is blank. And if you don't fall within my normative category, then you're not really a Christian. Now, we have theological arguments about that, so it's easier to see when you apply it to another tradition. So, say, for example, if you were to apply that to Buddhism, and you said, if you're really a Buddhist, like the real Buddhists, well, they're the guys that hold to the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. That's really what Buddhism is. Well, if that's what you think, and you propose that, if you stipulate that, you rule out Zen. Zen falls outside your description because they don't do that. That's not their thing, right? Or maybe you have a normative conception of Islam, a particular interpretation of the Quran. And historians do this as much as practitioners. And then you find that you're ruling out Sufism. right? You see, and so if you're a historian, you're not a theologian, you're a historian, and you're trying to take seriously people's self-representation. If someone comes to me and says, I'm a Christian, or I'm a Buddhist, or I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Hindu, or I'm a whatever, then as a historian, not as a theologian, but as a historian, I have to take seriously that self-representation and say, for that individual, for purposes of writing history, Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or Judaism is whatever that person says it is. Right? For that, just writing as a historian, I have to take seriously, they understand themselves to be a participant in this tradition, and what they mean by that is X.
Okay.
Right? And so Baird will really, really help you there. All right? That's just the academic part. Now, on the theological side, I also agree with you, right, that as a Catholic, Christianity is not our primary category. The church is our primary category. And Jesus doesn't say anything about founding some sort of, abstract pattern called Christianity into which we can fit all these historical instances. Jesus says, you're Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. He's talking about creating a living society of people in a particular kind of communion or fellowship, and entrusting to them a divine mandate, a task to hand on his teaching and the sacraments in perpetuity, right? So that's the primary category. The church, not something called Christianity, a concept that doesn't actually occur in the Bible anywhere, right? And for that matter, doesn't really occur in Christian antiquity either, right? So modern idea that's really emerged, from a kind of secular way of looking at the data to try to do what we were talking about earlier. Now, the church has embraced the idea of Christianity as opposed to just uniquely Catholicism, but they use that term as a way of accommodating the fact that we have things in common with other people that name the name of Jesus. Right? So while the church is the primary category, we look at Protestants, for example, and say, well, we've got a lot of stuff in common with them. And rather than just writing them off, the Second Vatican Council says they have elements of truth and sanctification. So what are we going to call those people? Well, we're not going to call them Catholics because they're not really.
Right.
But it would be, it'd be kind of uncharitable not to take seriously their self-representation as followers of Jesus. And so Christian seems like the best word available for us to identify that commonality, even though it risks the methodological problem that you identified. It risks creating in the mind the idea that the principal category is this thing called Christianity, into which the various forms fit. And that would be to misconstrue, I think, both from a historian's point of view as well as from a theological point of view, the way the data actually play out.
Ben, thanks so much for your call from Cincinnati. Appreciate hearing from you today. Let's go now to Tony. Tony's in Bowling Green, Kentucky, listening on Savior Radio Network. Hello, Tony. Happy Advent. What's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, happy Advent. Merry Christmas. My question is regarding investment. I assume many Catholics have to invest for retirement through their employer 401k or just through in some kind of individual account.
Mm-hmm.
So, trying to figure out what the church teaching, what my obligation as a practicing Catholic is in terms of investing in. Should I be thinking or looking at only like funds that reflect a Catholic morality, or am I?
Yes,
or am I
totally understand your question. So I'm going to give you some parameters, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. All right. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops publishes a document called Socially Responsible Investment Guidelines for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. It is not called Socially Responsible Investment Guidelines for all Catholics. These are the guidelines that the bishops themselves follow as they handle the temporal goods of the church.
Okay.
All right. And they have an interest in these guidelines that goes beyond you or me. Namely, because they publicly represent the church in a very profound way, they have to avoid the appearance of scandal to an extent that you and I do not. And so my own personal view is the bishop's guidelines are clearly safe, but they may be more restrictive than a lay Catholic would necessarily have to follow. Okay.
Okay.
Now I'm going to do some on-the-fly moral theology, and I would invite Catholic moral theologians who have thought of these issues more than I to correct me if I get something wrong.
Sure,
Okay, so
sure.
I'm not telling you infallibly this is the way it has to be, but I'll tell you how I think about it. Catholic moral theology says that there are different ways in which we can cooperate with evil. One way is material cooperation, and one way is formal cooperation, and there's some more divisions as well. Formal cooperation means that I intend the evil that is being done, right? And formal cooperation is always wrong. There are no exceptions. You may never formally cooperate with evil. So, let's say a company comes online and they say, our business model is to kill Catholics and flay them,
Wow.
and that's how we're going to make a buck, right? Well, that's objectively immoral, and I could never buy into that company for the express purpose of killing and flaying Catholics. Okay, that would be ruled out,
Yeah.
right? Then there is material cooperation. Now, material cooperation is when I provide some matter that facilitates the evil act. And material can be either proximate, that's up close, or remote. And remote material cooperation with evil can be allowable for a proportionate reason, right? And let me give you an example of how that might play out. Father Mitch Pacwa, as everybody knows, loves to go hunting.
Yep.
So I don't know how many guns he has, but I'm sure he's got a few, and he's got a bunch of ammo, right? And he uses that in his passion of hunting, and I think he's off hunting now, actually,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And that's a morally licit use of his time, and there's nothing immoral about a passion for hunting. And so there's a market for making weapons to serve people like Father Mitch who like to use them for that purpose.
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
could somebody grab a hold of similar weapons and similar ammo and use them in committing a crime? Yes, they could. Yes, they could. But the weapons manufacturers are not intending that outcome. Their goal is not to make this so that people can commit crimes. The goal is to make it so guys like Father Mitch can, go shoot wild hogs in Texas or someplace. Is there cooperation with evil if it's used in the commission of a crime? Yes. But they don't intend it, and they're pretty remote from the activity, and so that's okay, right? Proximate material cooperation with evil is you may not intend the outcome, but you're so close to the activity that you really can't extricate yourself from culpability. And the example I often use is imagine, say, the nurse who works in an abortion facility who says, I'm personally opposed to abortion. I think it's immoral. But I'm just materially cooperating. I'm not formally cooperating. When the doctor says, here, hand me the scalpel, and nurse hands the doctor the scalpel and he goes to work, that's too close. Her involvement is too proximate, and therefore it is immoral. Right? So where do we stand when it comes to investments? This is a little bit tricky. All right. Clearly, if you buy into a company, you are materially cooperating. If they do something evil, you're materially cooperating with evil. It seems to me that's unavoidable. You have to draw that conclusion because the resources that you're using to capitalize the company are facilitating whatever activity they're engaged in. So if you applied the idea that I will never buy into an investment or a company where anything bad goes on, you pretty much have to stuff your money under the mattress. Right, because in just the normal course of doing business, all kinds of evils are going to be perpetrated all the time, and it's just almost unavoidable. My father was a corporate attorney. He once said, David, if I only went into business with honest people, I'd starve to death. Right, Then there are those companies whose very business model is predicated on some grave evil, and I won't go into. I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm not going to specify what those industries are, but, you can use your imagination.
Sure.
For my own purposes, this is just me now, right?
Okay.
I have decided that there are a few industries that I'm not going to buy into personally because it seems to me that the very business model, it's not just secondary to their primary intent, but their intent, they're going to make money by doing something that is in itself intrinsically immoral, and that is central and foremost to their business practice. So there is an industry, for example, that manufactures products that kill people, and there's no good reason. It's not like a hunting rifle. Like this stuff kills people, and that's almost exactly what it's designed to do, right? I don't buy into those companies personally, okay? Now, there's a further entailment, right? And that is that there are, today, if you're buying into investment opportunities, very often you're not buying individual stocks. If you buy, say, an S&P index mutual fund, for example, the reason you're buying into a fund that's invested in the 500 top capitalization stocks in the U.S. economy, and your reason for doing that is because you want diversification in your portfolio, right? And you're pretty darn removed from the management decisions of the individual companies, right? And I don't think the U.S. bishops would buy into that because they don't want to have any affiliation, right, with those companies that at any level are doing anything that's questionable. I think there's room for discussion about whether an individual Catholic, should have qualms about that or not. And I've talked to Catholics who are Orthodox and faithful and conservative that say, index investing is okay. It's very, very remote, very, very distant from the actual activity. But I will leave that up to the discernment of your conscience. I've given you some parameters. I've given you some principles of Catholic moral theology, and I've told you what the bishops do. So there you go.
Tony, thanks so much for your call. David, I knew you would geek out on that question. As you've been handling money for a long time.
Well, so people are going to wonder what you mean when you say that. I used to be in the investments business,
yes.
Right? I did that for a while before I got into Catholic radio.
And we're glad that you are in Catholic radio. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Hey, don't forget, it's the 48 hours of Christmas, starting on Saturday morning at midnight Eastern, all the way through the end of the day on Christmas Day. We're going to bring you the 48 hours of Christmas, including music specials, live masses from around the world. We've got some great Mother Angelica Christmas specials, Fulton Sheen. The list goes on and on. You can check it out by going to EWTNradio.net, click on the word schedule, and you'll see what we are up to. Again, it starts Saturday at midnight Eastern, all the way through Christmas Eve day, all the way through Christmas Eve, and all day long on Christmas Day. Do check that out. Let's go to Pedro now. Pedro is in Tucson, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hello, Pedro. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hello. I was calling about to find out a little bit more about where Adam and Eve got their wives. Not their sons, got their wives.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I have a more or less about 50,000 years ago. That's when civilization really started. We started seeing art form, pottery. We started seeing things that really changed mankind.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So the question suggests that that when we're thinking about the question of human origins and anthropology and biology, that the narrative in Genesis should easily fit. We should be able to easily fit that in a coherent account of the biological and anthropological origins of Homo sapiens. And personally, I'm not persuaded that that's the correct way to read the Bible, that that's the right way to read Genesis. And it doesn't seem to me that the sacred author who composed the text had those kinds of questions in mind. And the stories in Genesis are primarily relevant to us because they display in narrative form theological and existential realities that are present to all of us every day, right? We're all confronted with the temptation to evil, to illegitimate firsthand knowledge of evil, to turn away from the path that God would set for us. And so there's a pattern that we see that's perennial. It's not only in the first Adam and the first Eve, but it's something that pervades human culture and human experience. And John Paul II, in his theology of the body, when he talks about the Genesis text, he says that's really the concern that we bring to these texts, not so much to find pedantic answers to pedantic questions about biological origins, but rather because these texts they tell a theology in a narrative form about realities that are present to all of us in our daily lives, right? And that's really the way to read it. So, if you do try to sort of fit the coherent picture and assume that I can situate Genesis in the context of ancient anthropology, how would you handle that? Well, I think you could say in the origin of the human species, it's quite possible that God infused the human soul into two hominids that you could call Adam and Eve, but it doesn't mean that there weren't biologically identical members of that hominid population that didn't have that dignity assigned to them, right? So that would be a way of handling the monogenesis hypothesis. That's exactly what Kenneth Kemp does in his article on creation and Genesis and monogenesis in the book of Genesis, trying to fit what we know about Genesis with Pius XII's encyclical Humani Generis.
All right. Very good. Pedro, thank you so much for your call. We're going to go now to line 1 and talk with Joe, listening in Palm Beach Garden, Florida. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind today?
Good afternoon. How are you?
Very good. What's on your mind today?
Well, I wanted to call in. I heard the tail end of your previous discussion where you were talking about faith-based investing and how folks may or may not be able to align with their faith and values. And I've been in the financial industry for over 30 years. I currently work as a financial advisor, and our industry has come a long way in offering alternatives that, for example, there's a number of choices for folks that want to follow the Conference of Catholic Bishops mandates under investing, which recently the Vatican also published I don't know what you would call it, a paper that is pretty closely aligned with Catholic bishops. But then there are Knights of Columbus is one example. Knights of Columbus now offers mutual funds that are aligned completely with that Catholic bishop's mandate.
Okay, we're right at the end of the show here. Any thoughts there, David?
That's true, and there are mutual fund companies that market, to Catholics under that description, and so that if that's the way a person wants to go, there are definitely investment options out there, so that's a possibility.
Very good. And now let's go to John in Smithtown, New York. John, we just have about a minute left. What's on your mind today?
Hello. I know Jesus told Nicodemus that to have salvation you must be born again, and I know we in the Catholic Church we believe that. I think that's when we believe happens at baptism, you're born again, but I'm not sure. But also, what is confirmation? Is that confirming your baptism because you were just a baby and you couldn't decide for yourself?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. You are born again in baptism. And that is not what confirmation does, right? Because you can be confirmed as a baby too. In fact, all Eastern Rite Catholics are confirmed or chrismated when they're babies. So it's not just like baptism 2.0. Confirmation is a different sacrament that gives grace in a different mode. Baptism unites us to Christ and the Church and makes us priests and members of His body. Confirmation really gives us strength for the public witness to the faith, that we could go out and live our vocations and be ministers, missionary disciples for Jesus and bear witness to Him in the world. And those are different vocations. Well, they're not different vocations. They're different modes of living the Christian life. One by our immediate identification with Christ through baptism. The other by really taking up the mission of the Church and bearing witness in the world.
Very good. And Cora in southwest Wisconsin wants to know, what happened to Enoch?
He was taken away. He was taken away. That's what the Scriptures tell us. Now, Second Temple Judaism had an apocryphal text called the Book of Enoch, that actually entered into the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's canon, but it's not in the Catholic canon of the Bible, that has all kinds of speculative wild stuff about Enoch, none of which is canonical for Catholics. So, you can go out and read the Book of Enoch just for historical interest, but don't take it too seriously unless you're Ethiopian.
Well, very good. Cora, sorry we couldn't get you on, but at least we got your question on. Dr. David Anders, have a wonderful weekend and Merry Christmas.
Thanks, Tom.
Got a great mailbag for you on tomorrow's program. I hope you will enjoy that. We are back live for you on Tuesday of next week. Looking forward to our next visit. On behalf of Dr. David Anders and Rich, Ace, and Michael, I'm Tom Price. Merry Christmas to you. See you next year. God bless.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
What a great grace it is to have the opportunity to use the airwaves for the honor and glory of God, to be able to talk to the hearts of individuals and meet them where they are in their relationship with our Lord.